From legendary filmmaker Tobe Hooper comes the 1974 classic that captured the imagination of audiences across America with one macabre question: who will survive, and what will be left of them? The infamous, the one and only, the mighty first chapter of one of horror's oldest and longest-running franchises, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is one of those horror films that is, for lack of a better phrase, a part of my DNA, a part of my very being. Just one of those movies that is just baked into the core of who I am as a person. Not to say that I'm a flesh-wearing, chainsaw-wielding madman who ruins expensive doors and keeps chickens in bird cages, but more so one that has been with this film since, pretty much, his infancy, and that I've almost literally been watching this film for my entire life. And that isn't an exaggeration. Say what you want about my upbringing, but I promise you that I have never killed anyone that didn't absolutely deserve it, and my flirtations with cannibalism amount to less than 3 incidents. So again, watching horror movies doesn't turn good little boys and girls into serial killers or psychopaths. I think the first aspect of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that becomes apparent from the very first shot of the film is that the aesthetic being presented here is one not unlike a documentary film. Gritty, voyeuristic, and very fly-on-the-wall in nature, as if we're experiencing the events of the film for real, versus seeing said events through the artsy glass of cinema, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The film feels so real and so raw and visceral that as a child, I remember thinking that I was actually seeing what really happened to these people in real time. 1, because the film told me that these events were true, and 2, because I wasn't really old enough yet to understand reenactments, acting, etc. I literally thought I was seeing what actually happened on August 18th, 1973. Even though we all understand that none of this actually happened and was all inspired by and based on the true story of Ed Gein. But that's besides the point. I think this is one of the reasons this film remains so frightening for me today, and was especially frightening to me as a child. The movie was intriguing, fantastic, and had me glued to the screen every time I watched it, but the experience was always abrasively frightening nonetheless. Again, I thought what I was seeing was real, so Leatherface, as he appeared in the film, was an actual person who actually existed, which shook me to my core, and definitely made him the true horror of horror movies for me. And this is why he remains so scary to me today, because that childhood feeling of, this is real, never really dissipated, even though we know everything about this movie, from the cast and crew, to the production, to the behind-the-scenes exploits, problem with distribution, all of that stuff. That unnerving feeling never really goes away. It still feels like a legitimate snuff film. As far as I'm concerned, the film is, always has been, and always will be, one of the scariest films ever made, if not the scariest. The story of the film is exceedingly simple, and rightfully so. It isn't bogged down by elusive plot twists, too many characters, or an unnecessary amount of backstory, and these attributes only help the film. After hearing reports of grave robbing and grave desecration occurring at a local cemetery their grandfather is buried at, siblings Sally and Franklin Hardesty decide to visit the graveyard and make sure his grave has been left in one piece. Upon leaving the cemetery, they decide to visit the old Franklin place, which is a rotting and abandoned Hardesty family homestead, still standing in the middle of nowhere. On the way, they encounter a lack of gasoline, a very strange gas station clerk, and a psychotic hitchhiker who manages to slice Franklin's arm before being kicked out of the van. After finally arriving at the house and exploring the surrounding area, Sally and her friends soon fall afoul of a crazed and deranged family taking up residence in a neighboring farmhouse, a family we later come to know as the Sawyers. The horror begins with Kirk and Pam, who encounter Leatherface himself while searching for gas, approaching the Sawyer home after noticing their gas-fueled generator outside. In one of the most frightening sequences ever put to film, we not only catch our first look ever of the terrifying Leatherface, but we see Kirk and Pam dispatched in some truly unforgettably uncomfortable ways. The film already had a surreal and mean-spirited atmosphere about it, but this scene really cemented and solidified that, and we as an audience really knew what we were in store for upon seeing it. Once more, this didn't feel like a movie. These felt like real people, and Leatherface felt like an actual person. Absolutely shocking, horrifying, and spine-chilling. Soon thereafter, Jerry meets a similar fate. Franklin and Sally venture into the woods to find their friends. Franklin is dispatched by a proactively murderous Leatherface, trying to figure out who all these intrusive hippies are, and after encountering the gas station clerk from earlier yet again, Drayton Sawyer as we come to know him in later films, Sally soon finds herself beaten unconscious, gagged, and tied to a chair in the midst of some kind of frenzied late-night dinner at the Sawyer house, joined not only by Drayton himself, but also the hitchhiker, and of course, Leatherface, now dressed in very unnerving dinner attire. After a horrifying encounter with Grandpa, who is actually still alive, contrary to what Sally assumed when first coming upon his supposed corpse, where the old man drinks her blood and attempts to relive his glory days by killing her with a sledgehammer, Sally manages to free herself, jump through the window, and make her escape in the wee hours of the next morning. This infamous chase sequence eventually closes out the film, with the hitchhiker being run over, Sally making her escape, and Leatherface dancing angrily in the streets, flailing around with his chainsaw in rage-driven defeat. Surely one of the most profoundly unnerving sequences to ever end a horror film, and an abrupt one at that. It simply cuts to black in the middle of Leatherface's tantrum, seemingly out of nowhere, and an ending that adds to the rawness and seemingly authentic nature of the film as this supposed true account. I keep using the word raw, and I think that's because it so perfectly encapsulates how this film is presented. Raw, rugged, gritty, and real. As I've said before, this film feels more like a documentary depicting actual events than any standard Hollywood fare, and raw is simply one of the best words you can think of to describe it. From the previously mentioned cinematography itself, to the gripping original score, if you can call it a score at all, to the unnerving sound effects, the believability of the main characters, or the nightmarish portrayals of the Sawyer family members themselves, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is truly a tour de force when it comes to not only horror movies, but cinema itself. I can still recall that first time ever seeing Leatherface show up on screen, just being frozen in place and just mute, horrified, holding my breath, unable to truly comprehend this skin-wearing madman before me. And this feeling and memory has never left me, always in the back of my mind, always giving me a slight bit of anxiety whenever I decide to put this movie on for another rewatch, knowing full well everything there is to know about the movie, about what a nice guy Gunnar Hansen was, to how awesome of a person Jim Sedow was, to how much Marilyn Burns went through on this film, may they rest in peace, to everyone else involved in the movie, both on screen and behind the scenes, both living and dead, with not a stone unturned as far as the film's production goes. It still gives me the creeps every time I watch it, and it still, somehow, feels like I'm watching an account of true events rather than a work of complete fiction, and that says something about the quality of this picture, and surely accounts for much of its longevity with horror fans and fans of cinema worldwide. With that said, I just want to take a moment and give it up for one of my favorite horror directors of all time, and absolutely a hero of mine, and an inspiration for me when it comes to cinema. The man, the myth, the legend himself, Tobe Hooper. Rest in peace, sir. Rest in peace. When it comes to the Chainsaw Massacre franchise, this is the holy grail of the series, as it should be. I love this movie, and as much as it horrifies me and gives me anxiety, I can't help but cherish this film. One of the greatest horror movies ever made, if not the greatest. It introduced the world to the Sawyer family and Leatherface, one of horror's greatest icons, and introduced people worldwide who were unaware of it before to the existence of head cheese.
Boiling down into a big chili effect.
Now, you're probably thinking that I'm going to give this film a solid 10 out of 10, right? The perfect TobattoVision score. Of course, this movie deserves no less than a 10, am I right? But I'm not going to give this movie a 10. For the first time on TobattoVision, I'm going to give a film the highest rating possible, beyond a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, beyond the rating scale. The pinnacle of horror movies, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is a crystal skull. Returning to the story that began 13 years prior, legendary filmmaker Tobe Hooper brings us the fantastically gory, ferociously funny, and infinitely controversial sequel to his 1974 original, 1986's infamous The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is another one of those horror movies, like the original film, that is just a part of me, burned into my very DNA, so to speak. Not to say that I've been watching it for as long as the original film, but almost just as long. And like that first film, this movie is simply ingrained in my mind. Now, I think I need to start this off by addressing the comedic aspects of this film. And although the original film had a lot of tiny little comedic moments, which I never really picked up on because the film was so damn shocking to me as a child, Part 2 seems to take the comedy and dial it up to 10 notches, because this movie is one hell of a cartoony, frenzied, funny ride straight into the bowels of hell, and is probably the farthest away from the first film, tonally, that Tobe Hooper could have gotten, and intentionally so. With that said, this movie is not a flat-out comedy. It is definitely more of a horror film than a comedy film, as it should be, and definitely has some truly scary stuff and intense scenes on display within its runtime. But there's a very cartoony, Fellini vibe throughout the film, where a lot of incidental stuff is legitimately funny, but there's also some really crazy stuff happening here, regarding some really crazy characters and situations that are, from the point of view of the characters, probably horrifying, but to us as the viewers, come off as either funny, goofy, downright weird, or a combination of all three. For example, LG spitting all the time and calling Stretch darlin' is funny.
LG! More darling!
Lefty going insane and doing this. Or this.
I'm the Lord of the harvest.
Who's that?
is also funny. Extremely funny, actually. But in a that's so crazy it's funny kind of way. Then you just have the downright weird and abstract stuff, like this old chainsaw dealer going wild as he watches Lefty testing out the chainsaws. I mean, look at this dude. See what I mean? This is the tone of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. It's a horror comedy, but it's horror in the most horror of ways, and it's comedy in the most insane ways possible. I think what I'm trying to say is this. If you're looking for a movie with a similar tone to the original, this is not it. But it also somehow feels perfectly in line with the first film and of the same world, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The film isn't really a direct sequel to the original, taking place 13 years later and in a completely different area, but it does follow the same continuity and does exist in the same world, with the events of the first film mentioned from time to time, and one of our main characters directly related to the characters of the first. However, this story focuses more on a local radio DJ known as Stretch, played by the magnificent Caroline Williams, who aspires to be more than a simple disc jockey. Her partner in crime is a guy called LG, played in hilarious fashion by the late and great Lou Perryman, who definitely has the hots for Stretch, but it becomes clear quite quickly that she is just not into him in that way, but you have to hand it to the guy for never giving up.
God damn it!
In the middle of a routine night at the radio station, Stretch receives a few annoying phone calls from a pair of drunk yuppies who are insistent on staying on the phone with her and talking nonsense, before soon encountering the Sawyer family on the highway. A high-speed massacre ensues, and not only do both of these yuppies meet their fate at the hands of a manic Leatherface, but Stretch and LG hear it all go down. Although the scene is crazed and fast-paced and somewhat dreamlike, the appearance of Leatherface sort of comes out of nowhere, and the violence that ensues is a great taste of things to come for the rest of the film. And although the scene is executed in somewhat hokey fashion, intentionally no doubt, the events that actually transpire within the context of the film are inarguably terrifying for both Stretch, LG, and certainly the yuppies themselves, whose lives ended in grisly fashion at the hands of the chainsaw-wielding, skin mask-wearing psychopath. A great contrast to the comedy of Chainsaw 2. The next morning, we're finally introduced to our secondary hero, Lefty Enright, a former Texas Ranger and a man clearly on a mission to hunt down the Sawyer family, as he is revealed to be the uncle of both Sally and Franklin from the original film. Lefty, played in glorious fashion by the man, the myth, the legend, the late and great Dennis Hopper, shows up at the scene of the previous night's murder, where the wreck of the vehicle remains, but the bodies of the two yuppies have mysteriously been taken. After noticing peculiar chainsaw marks in one of the doors, Lefty puts two and two together and knows this can only mean one thing: the Sawyers are here. This is how a sequel is done right. It changes up the formula, but keeps the core of the original intact. Stretch and Lefty are new characters, but Lefty has a direct line to the original film and has a legitimate beef with the Sawyer clan. Therefore, we not only have a new direction for the film that isn't a simple Xerox of the first, but we also have that conduit from the original to the sequel. And with such an eclectic and strong performer such as Dennis Hopper in the role of Lefty, you know we're in for some crazy stuff. Stretch eventually goes to Lefty for help, hell-bent on doing something real, aka finding out who committed these atrocities she recorded the other night, and Lefty, reluctantly, agrees to join her on her quest, knowing full well that this quest began for him years prior to the murder of those two yuppies. He convinces Stretch to play the recording on her radio show, live on the air, in order to not only convince the general public and the police that something weird is going on, but to also hopefully flush out the assailants themselves. Well, it works, much to the dismay of Stretch and the detriment of LG, because the station is soon under siege by the Sawyer clan, specifically Chop Top, played brilliantly by Bill Moseley, and Leatherface himself, this time played by Bill Johnson, who actually does an excellent job in the role. When all is said and done, the station is ransacked, LG is supposedly murdered and taken by the family, and Stretch, after having a very peculiar encounter with Leatherface, nicknamed Bubba in this film, is spared by the skin-masked madman. With Lefty nowhere in sight, Stretch is forced to jump in her vehicle and follow Chop Top's truck closely, hell-bent on finding out where these psychopaths reside. In one of the film's best production design choices, we soon find ourselves at the main setting for the remainder of the film, an abandoned amusement park-like property once called Texas Battleland, which has become the residence of the Sawyer family, a place they most likely fled to after the events of the original film. It's here that Lefty and Stretch are reunited, and after falling through the ground and into the underground lair of the Sawyers, it's up to Lefty, chainsaws in hand and holster, to save Stretch, defeat the Sawyers, and save the day, Texas Ranger style. I know I touched on this film's absolutely insane nature, but this is really where it shifts into high-gear madness, and the film's incredible visual style, production design, and the fantastically played characters really have a chance to shine. The pace is fast, the editing is punctual, the moody atmosphere is on full, beautifully macabre display. Everything about this portion of the film feels like an increasingly volatile acid trip that just builds and builds and builds, with seemingly no end in sight. The set design here is just on another level entirely. I mean, it just blows my mind how detailed and spooky this place is. As far as the gore effects and nastiness goes, Tom Savini shines here as well. I mean, the gore in this film is just gross, in the best way possible. It almost makes you feel like you need to take a shower after watching this thing. After reuniting with a half-dead and very skinless LG, who succumbs to his wounds shortly thereafter, Stretch traverses the maze of this underground lair, trying to find her escape while dodging the encroaching Sawyer family members. Meanwhile, Lefty brings it all down.
Bring it all down!
Finds some guts, and is reunited with his nephew Franklin in what plays out as a very somber, disturbing, and sad scene, and the dying flashlight is the icing on the cake of this morbid scene.
Franklin.
The family soon comes across Stretch, with Drayton berating Bubba for not finishing the job he was assigned to, which was supposed to result in Stretch's death back at the radio station. But Leatherface, in this movie, is crushing hard on the radio DJ and seems to be physically infatuated with Stretch, and that's putting it lightly.
Bubba's got a girlfriend!
After a slew of crazy escapades, a confrontation with Grandpa Sawyer, and the arrival of Lefty Enright, the Chainsaw sequel concludes with a tabletop chainsaw battle between Lefty and Leatherface, a chase sequence with Chop Top and Stretch, and the suicide bombing of Drayton Sawyer. Yes, you heard that right. After Drayton is injured by Lefty's chainsaw, he decides to use one of Nubbin's grenades to blow himself to smithereens, seemingly taking Lefty, who has now put a chainsaw completely through Leatherface's stomach, and Leatherface himself, along with him, in an explosion that sends smoke pouring out of the underground lair. By the way, Nubbins is the mummified corpse of the hitchhiker from the first film, and the brother of Chop Top. Upon coming across a mummified grandma and stealing her chainsaw, Stretch, going full beast mode, kills Chop Top, declares victory, and dances maniacally at the top of the structure, not unlike Leatherface's rage dance at the end of the first film. I mean, what a ride this film is. Completely unlike the first film, but so much like the first film at the same time. And unless you've seen the films, it's hard to really understand what I mean by that. The film definitely looks, sounds, and feels different than the first, and they have quite dissimilar tones, but they both feel a part of the same world, the same continuity, the same characters, just presented in this dreamlike, drug-induced coma pit of insanity, and I love every minute of it. Everyone involved in this film brought their A-game, and Tobe Hooper, as much flack as he caught for the sudden tonal change between the first film and this sequel, was hopefully proud of it, because this film is absolutely revered by fans, more now than it ever has been in the past, and I hope he really got a clear view of that before he passed away back in 2017. With that said, a big rest in peace to Tobe Hooper, as well as Lou Perryman, who was murdered back in 2009, God rest his soul, Dennis Hopper, who passed away in 2010, and Jim Sedow, who passed away in 2003, and Kit Carson, who passed away in 2014, who wrote and rewrote the film dozens of times based on the continuing budget cuts. I haven't touched on this yet, but I seriously need to point out how amazing Jim Sedow was in this film, returning to the role of the cook from the first film, or finally named in this film as Drayton Sawyer, the patriarch of the Sawyer clan, and an absolute legend of a character when it comes to horror movies. And he works extremely well within the Sawyer trio on display in this film. Dennis Hopper also kills it in the role as Lefty, and his performance is often overlooked. It sickens me, but it's a fantastic performance, and it deserves far more credit than it gets. Caroline Williams is also excellent in the film, and she's probably the best heroine out of the entire Chainsaw franchise. I implore you to see Chainsaw 2. It is every bit as good as you've heard, and if you've heard anyone denounce the film or say that it's bad, just know that they are completely full of it. Chainsaw 2 is a masterpiece in and of itself, and the only true Chainsaw sequel of the entire franchise. There, I said it. Also, I forgot to mention this. So you know the movie is bound to be awesome. Some of you may not agree, but this sequel is not only one of the best horror sequels ever made, but is also one of the best horror movies ever made in general. In and of itself, a fantastic journey into the bowels of insanity, fantastically written and directed, well acted, great production design and effects, some truly funny moments, some truly scary moments, and all in all, an unforgettable cinematic experience. I'm not joking when I say this, and I will argue with anyone who says otherwise. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is not a 10 out of 10. It's beyond that. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is a crystal skull. From filmmaker Jeff Burr comes the second sequel of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, and the first to not be helmed by Tobe Hooper himself. An entry extremely divisive among the Chainsaw fanbase, and one that boasted a production so troublesome that Jeff Burr himself demanded his own name be taken off the film, which obviously didn't happen, but nonetheless, an infamous film for an array of infamous reasons, and it's the 1990 Chainsaw film that ushered in the highly debated New Line Cinema era of the franchise, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Unlike the first two entries of the series, Chainsaw 3 is not a film I would consider ingrained in me, not something that's burned into the very DNA of my being. I saw this film several years later in comparison to the first two. I don't think I saw this till 95 or 96, which is weird to think about now, considering how much I loved those first two films, and how often I saw the VHS of this movie on shelves back in the day. That gnarled, long-haired Leatherface, barely lit by pinks, reds, and blues, adorned with a diagonal chainsaw, and in big, bold red letters, Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. For some reason, it just took me a long time to rent this movie. Not because I wasn't interested, not because the cover of the VHS freaked me out, but I guess because if I was renting a chainsaw movie, it was either the first or second film, and since I had no experience with this one yet, I guess I really just didn't care. When I finally did rent the film, however, I became an immediate fan. Right from the start, the film has an angrier tone than the first two films, and is executed in a more straightforward horror movie style than the first sequel, but also seems more streamlined and polished and Hollywood than the original, and never really tries to return to that scarier, more realistic, documentary-like style, for better or for worse. I personally would have loved to see a return to the gritty, raw nature of the original, but we got what we got, and I was happy with how Leatherface turned out, considering. It definitely feels like an early 90s New Line Cinema film. Take that as you will. The story begins with a recently uncovered dumping ground in Texas, where dozens and dozens of human corpses, or pieces of corpses I should say, have been uncovered by the authorities. After a brief appearance by none other than Stretch herself, we quickly meet our main characters, new final girl Michelle, played by Kate Hodge, and her boyfriend Ryan, played by William Butler, who are driving across country in order to deliver the vehicle to her father in Florida. They're told by police to
keep moving, don't stop for nothing or nobody.
And we're soon on our way into the meat and potatoes of this new story. Now, I think Ryan and Michelle technically are on a break by the time we meet them in the story, so I guess it's sort of up in the air if they're really together as a couple or not, so to speak. But Ryan's at least along for the trip, and you know what they say, somebody's got to finish off the armadillo when nobody else will. So far, we have a very deliciously ominous ambiance about the film. Very moody, very serious, very dark, and once the film switches over to the daylight of the following morning, we catch a great glimpse of the surrounding California countryside, doubling for Texas for the very first time in the franchise, as this is the first film in the franchise to not film in Texas, for better or worse. I mean, look at those hills. I guess it could pass for Texas, right? Nonetheless, a dry Texas desert in the middle of absolutely nowhere, just as a chainsaw movie should be. I guess I should point out a few of the elephants in the room regarding this movie before we proceed any further, because although this film is marketed and portrayed to be the third film of the Chainsaw Massacre series, it almost plays more as a soft reboot of the first film, because a lot of stuff, not everything, but a lot of stuff, either doesn't add up to the events of the first two films, or seemingly disregards them completely. I mean, yes, on paper, this is part 3 of the series that began with the original Chainsaw and continued with part 2 back in 1986. But let's take a quick look at the film itself. Why is Leatherface even around? He had a chainsaw through his guts at the end of the first sequel. Not to mention he was blown sky high by Drayton's grenade, along with Drayton himself. Yet, here Leatherface is, wearing a leg brace, walking with a slight limp because of it. But other than that, seemingly perfectly fine. We also have Grandpa, this time mummified and long since dead, but physically in the film nonetheless. How the hell did he get here? Who pulled him out of the underground lair? Also, who the hell is this family, and how do they relate to the Sawyers? My answer to all of these questions is this. Chainsaw 3, again, is a soft reboot. Sure, it touches on elements of the first two films, such as the appearance of Stretch and the insignia on the chainsaw itself, the Saw's family, which was uttered by Drayton in part 2, but beyond that, this film really plays more like a remake of the original story than a direct sequel to part 2. After putting the armadillo out of its misery, Michelle and Ryan soon find themselves at a rundown gas station and meet a very strange gas station clerk by the name of Alfredo, played in fantastic sleazeball fashion by Tom Everett, who enjoys taking Polaroids of people, who tries and fails to sell Michelle the picture, only to mutter insanely to himself as he proceeds to pump the gas. A man named Tex, played by a very young Viggo Mortensen, chats politely with Michelle before asking for a ride, only to be shot down by an obviously jealous and cautious Ryan, but Tex graciously accepts the rejection. After using the porno-lined restroom, Alfredo and Tex have a very violent altercation once Tex catches the gas station clerk peeping at Michelle through the wall, and this leads to an armed and dangerous Alfredo pointing a shotgun at both the couple and at Tex himself. Tex tells them to drive off, and as they do, they witness Alfredo shoot down the ride-needing cowboy. At least, so they think. Although Alfredo comes off as very quirky and cartoony at first, and the banter between him and Tex seems almost funny at first, once this altercation happens and the situation devolves, it actually feels quite tense, and is executed rather brilliantly as far as building as much tension and unease as possible. I'm aware that a lot of people do not like this film, but you at least have to admire the fact that when things go south in this movie, things really go south, and intense scenes like this truly feel of the moment, and they're anxiety-inducing. Soon thereafter, a very gnarled and foreboding-looking pickup truck roars out of the gas station garage, and night falls on the terrified couple, who soon fall afoul of this crazed pickup truck and its driver, assumed to be Alfredo, and the couple are soon run off the road, blowing a tire in the process. As Ryan attempts to replace the tire, Michelle grows more and more paranoid, hearing approaching sounds that are making her extremely uncomfortable. Finally, just as Ryan is finished with the tire, the roar of a chainsaw cuts through the darkness, and Leatherface, illuminated only by flashlight, finally makes his appearance in Chainsaw 3, sporting long, rock and roll hair and one pissed-off attitude. Naturally, the skin-masked madman goes after Ryan and Michelle, who manage to drive off just in the nick of time, leaving behind an even more pissed-off Leatherface. I have to note just how gnarly Leatherface looks in this film. Although it's not my favorite look of the character, not by a long shot, there's definitely some attributes that I think are noteworthy here. First of all, the beige and tan outfit works really well against the Texas desert backdrop color palette of the film. The knee brace does in fact look and sound pretty cool, and the mask, although not my favorite in the franchise, looks very much like fresh, wet skin that was recently cut off someone's face, which it was, as illustrated during the film's opening credit sequence. His teeth are absolutely horrid, and somehow look even worse than his teeth from Part 2. But what really keeps this iteration, visually, from climbing higher on the ladder for me, is the long hair. I don't think the long heavy metal hair really suits Leatherface, and although it complements the film's more heavy metal soundtrack, I think it lessens the potential scary factor of the chainsaw-wielding cannibal. The film shifts into its main course once the characters, upon seeing a bloodied Tex stranded in the middle of the road, swerve to avoid hitting him, only to wind up crashing along with another driver, who happens to be in the same area, a survivalist named Benny, played by the legendary badass Ken Faree, who not only helps the couple get out of the car and begins tending their wounds, but also hilariously calls them crazy while hearing their seemingly insane story.
Sounds like he's just a few quarts shy of a full tank, you know what I mean?
Benny soon agrees to help the couple find their friend Tex, who, for whatever reason, was standing bloodied in the middle of the road. On the way, Benny comes across a hook-handed man named Tinker, played by Joe Unger, who offers his assistance by setting down road flares. At this point, Benny is unaware that the truck this weird man is driving is actually the same one that chased down Michelle and Ryan earlier that evening. However, Benny soon realizes Tinker's intentions after he finds a damaged chainsaw in the back of the truck. He flees the scene and abruptly encounters Leatherface after falling down a hill, but is saved by a disheveled woman named Sarah, played by Toni Hudson, who had recently escaped from Leatherface in the clutches of the Sawyers. Benny learns that Sarah's entire family was killed and that the Sawyer family is actually watching the roads. The poor woman is clearly shell-shocked by her experiences, and unknown to Benny, the mask that Leatherface is currently wearing is actually the face of Sarah's sister, Gina, played by Beth DePatie, in the opening title sequence. And more gruesome than that, Sarah actually watched her sister's face be turned into the macabre and rose-tattooed face mask. Benny hears Michelle and Ryan calling out for him and leaves Sarah in the woods with every intention on returning to her. But naturally, Leatherface ends up killing her very soon thereafter. Everything really goes to hell when Ryan gets caught in a bear trap, and from the point of view of Michelle, who Ryan insistently tells to keep running, believes her boyfriend to be murdered right then and there. Michelle quickly locates a house and believes to have finally found help, but after she meets a suspiciously creepy little girl, played by Jennifer Banco, carrying a doll with an infant's skull as its head, she knows she's in trouble, and it's at this point that Michelle is captured by Tex, revealed to be one of the Sawyer family members all along, who brings her into the kitchen and introduces her to the already deceased and decomposed grandpa, who apparently at least made it out of the underground lair from part 2 in one piece. Enter Miriam Byrd Nethery as the character of Mama, the no-bullshit matriarch of the Sawyer family, at least this facet of the family, that is. Tinker then drags in the badly injured Ryan, whom he and Tex suspend upside down with a pair of meat hooks. When Leatherface returns home, Tex equips him with a large golden chainsaw with the words, "The saw is family" engraved on it, built by Tinker. This must have been some kind of Sawyer family motto, or at least one used often enough by Drayton that this faction of the Sawyer clan decided to pay tribute to the late Cook. Regardless, this chainsaw is epic, and I don't care how cheesy it is or how lame some chainsaw fans find it to be, this Cadillac chainsaw is chainsaw perfection, and I wish it would have been used more in the film itself. On his way through the woods, Benny encounters Alfredo, who just so happens to be dumping pieces of his, presumably, ex-girlfriend into the swamp. After a verbal confrontation, Benny knocks him into the dark swamp waters, and that's the last we see of Alfredo, at least for now. As the family prepare for dinner in the kitchen, the little girl is tasked with killing the barely alive Ryan, as Michelle watches. Leatherface prepares to kill Michelle as well, but Benny, here to save the day, has luckily come across the Sawyer homestead as well, and opens fire on the house with an automatic rifle before Michelle could be executed, killing Mama, blowing off Tinker's fingers, and knocking the new chainsaw right from Bubba's hands. Michelle makes her escape and flees into the woods in the midst of all the smoke and confusion, pursued by Leatherface, who seemingly kills Benny by running him over with Tinker's truck. But, as all American badasses tend to do, Benny survives yet again, but immediately comes face to face with a manic Tex. But no worries, Benny ends up lighting the cowboy on fire as the little girl watches from the window. Jesus. The film ends with Benny catching up with Leatherface and Michelle in the middle of the swamps, where Leatherface seemingly kills Benny. At this point, I'm convinced Benny can't die, and Michelle, in a moment of pure badassness, bashes in Leatherface's face with a giant rock and leaves the chainsaw-wielding madman to drown. As dawn breaks, Michelle reaches the main road before Alfredo's pickup truck suddenly appears, driven by a surviving Benny. Dude, this guy is an absolute madman. As Benny helps her into the truck, Alfredo appears and attacks him. God, does anybody in this film actually die ever? At this point, I'm waiting for the damn armadillo to show up. Michelle doesn't hesitate one bit when she gets the drop on Alfredo, shooting the lunatic dead right there in the back of the truck. All is well. Michelle and Benny share a mutual thought.
There's roadkill all over Texas.
Got that right.
And the two drive off into the sunrise, unaware that a surviving Leatherface, somehow I have no idea, walks into frame, angrily revving his chainsaw as yet another final girl gets away. Come to think of it, Leatherface has a really bad track record of not getting the girl. All in all, I really enjoy Chainsaw 3, and whether or not you grew up watching the R-rated or unrated versions of the film, I feel like the movie is enjoyable nonetheless, regardless of which cut you choose. I realize the production on the film was riddled with trouble, and Jeff Burr has only just recently begun to warm up to the film, rather than being devastated by the loss of the film he originally set out to make, which really never got to be made, or at least never had the chance to be properly edited. probably more of an amalgamation of all of those factors versus just one or the other. Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 is a very gritty, angry, and dark film that was really trying to make a mark for itself in this brand new New Line Cinema era of the series at that time. Although this never really took off in the way producers had hoped, for obvious reasons, I think the film has always been very watchable and very enjoyable as a Chainsaw sequel, and it's only aged better with time. All of the actors do a great job, the production design was on point, even though we don't really get to see much of it because of how dark the film is, literally. The editing is punctual, the original score is unforgivingly foreboding, the tone and vibe of the film is cold and ruthless, and it really does work well as a soft reboot of the Sawyer family story, rather than a direct sequel to Chainsaw 2. If you never saw this film, do yourself a solid and see it. You'll probably at least enjoy it on a base level, especially if you're a fan of Leatherface movies. If you haven't seen it in a long time, do yourself the honors of giving it another chance. I think you may just change your mind. Jeff Burr's Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 is a scary good time. From filmmaker and original Chainsaw writer Kim Henkel comes the fourth entry in the Chainsaw franchise. Arguably the weirdest and most abstract movie in the series, featuring the likes of pre-fame Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger, in a story that tries to be both a sequel and a reboot of the overall original story, yet injecting the narrative with some of the zaniest characters and most acid-trip narrative choices seen in any Chainsaw movie ever. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. In what started out as a project called The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a weird title when you think about it, Kim Henkel, one of two writers from the original film, the other being Tobe Hooper of course, sought to make a chainsaw film that really brought the series back to the tone and vibe of the 1974 original, which for most people meant a film that was gritty and real, visceral and unforgiving in tone, shot in documentary-style methods, and very small in scale, especially in comparison to the second and third films. Whether we really got those things in the final version of this movie is debatable, but there's no denying that Henkel did give us the weirdest chainsaw film ever made. To this day, even with all the requels and prequels and what have you, nothing has ever come close to Next Generation's level of wackiness and avant-garde way of storytelling. There's a fantastic making-of documentary about this film, and I highly suggest you watch it, because it really is a great look into the madness behind this movie. I would like to point out that, unlike Chainsaw 3, Next Generation was actually shot in Texas, so big props to Kim Henkel for that. Not California, not Louisiana, not Bulgaria, but Texas, where a Leatherface movie should be shot. The movie also does stand out as the one chainsaw film in the series that just feels totally different than any other, not just because of the aforementioned weirdness, but because it just seems to have a different attitude about it. When you throw in those aspects, as well as Leatherface's overt cross-dressing, the parody and self-referencing, and the secret society subplot, yes, you heard that correctly, you have yourself a movie that is bold and unapologetic in its effort to be its own thing, regardless of what the fans ended up thinking about it. On May 22nd, 1994, four teenagers, Barry, Heather, Jenny, and Sean, played by Tyler Cohn, Lisa Marie Newmeyer, Renee Zellweger, and John Harrison respectively, attend their school's prom. When Heather discovers Barry cheating on her with another girl, she storms out of the dance, followed closely by Barry, who tries to explain himself as they drive away in his car. Their argument is interrupted by Jenny and Sean, who are hiding in the back seat, smoking marijuana. Heather takes a detour off the freeway and, while distracted, collides with another motorist, played by Vince Brock, who passes out in the ensuing confusion. Jenny, Heather, and Barry leave Sean to look after the unconscious motorist, while they search for help. They stop at an office trailer, where they meet Darla, an insurance agent, played by Tony Perinsky, who promises to call her boyfriend, a tow truck driver named Vilmer. They leave the office and begin heading back towards the wreck. Vilmer soon shows up at the scene of the wreck, played by Matthew McConaughey, killing the motorist before chasing Sean in his truck and backing over him repeatedly. Meanwhile, Heather and Barry become separated from Jenny and discover an old farmhouse in the woods. As Barry looks around, Heather is attacked by Leatherface, played by Robert Jacks, and is subsequently forced into a meat locker. One of Vilmer and Leatherface's family members, W.E. Slaughter, played by Joe Stevens, finds Barry and holds him at gunpoint before forcing him inside. Also, W.E. Slaughter sounds very similar to W.E. Sawyer, heard in the opening crawl of Texas Chainsaw 3. Barry tricks W.E. and locks him out, but while using the bathroom, Barry discovers a corpse in the bathtub. He is then killed by Leatherface with a sledgehammer. After killing Barry, Leatherface impales Heather on a meat hook. Jenny returns to the scene of the wreck, where she is met by Vilmer, who offers her a ride. She accepts, only for Vilmer to threaten her life, before showing her the bodies of Sean and the motorist. Jenny jumps out of the truck and runs into the woods. She is soon attacked by Leatherface, resulting in a lengthy chase through the farmhouse, where she finds several preserved corpses in an upstairs bedroom. After leaping through an upstairs window, Jenny manages to flee the property. She seeks refuge from Darla, who reveals herself to be in league with the killers. When W.E. shows up and beats her with a cattle prod, the two put her in Darla's trunk, and she leaves to pick up some pizzas for dinner. After being tormented by Vilmer, Jenny momentarily escapes, attempting to drive off in Darla's car. She is stopped by Vilmer, who knocks her unconscious. She soon awakens at a dinner table, surrounded by the family, who reveal they are employed by a secret society to terrorize people that may cross their path. A man named Rothman, played by James Gale, shows up, reprimanding Vilmer for his methods, before revealing an array of scars and piercings on his torso and licking Jenny's face. Rothman leaves and Vilmer terrorizes his family and Jenny, killing Heather by crushing her skull under his cybernetic leg and knocking W.E. unconscious with a hammer. Vilmer and Leatherface prepare to kill Jenny, who breaks free and, using the controller to control Vilmer's leg, escapes. Jenny reaches a dirt road where she is rescued by an elderly couple in an RV, played by Gira Wilcott and Axel Schiller, respectively. However, Leatherface and Vilmer run them off the road, resulting in the RV falling on its side. Jenny emerges from the vehicle unscathed and continues running, with Leatherface and Vilmer in hot pursuit. A plane swoops down on Vilmer, killing him when one of the wheels grazes his skull. Leatherface screams in anguish while Jenny looks on. Suddenly, a limousine pulls up and Jenny jumps into the back seat, where she is again met by Rothman, who apologizes to her, explaining her experience was supposed to be spiritual and that Vilmer had to be stopped. He offers to take her to a police station or a hospital, and she ends up getting dropped off at a hospital, where she speaks to an officer. Sally Hardesty, being pushed by on a gurney and played once again by Marilyn Burns in a tiny cameo role, meets Jenny's gaze. Blink and you might miss it, but if you look closely, two other Chainsaw alumni make cameo appearances in the scene as well, the first being John Dugan, who played Grandpa in the first film as a police officer, and the other being Paul A. Partain, who played Franklin in the '74 film, now playing an orderly. Back on the dirt road, as the sun sets, Leatherface continues to flail his chainsaw in despair. Well, that's Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. Kim Henkel definitely brought a binder full of acid to set every day. Come on, y'all, let's make a movie. And then this movie was the result of that. Strange, weird, completely insane, completely on another level. I'm not sure what level that would even be, but another level nonetheless. I remember hearing about this movie a while before I finally came across it in the video store. I was 11 when the movie finally hit shelves, so not only do I remember reading about it in Fangoria, or at least that's where I assume I read about it since that was the only horror magazine I was reading at the time, but I remember the guys in the video store telling me about it as well, knowing how much I loved the other movies. I even got a full-sized poster of the movie, gifted to me by the video store. Yes, video stores were on another level back then, especially the mom and pop ones, where you legitimately knew and talked with the video store clerks back in the day. And I swear the poster was reversible, just like the VHS of the movie itself, but that may be a false memory I'm confusing with said VHS tape itself. Regardless, I had the poster, knew about the movie, and when it finally came out, I of course rented it. I vividly remember hating the way the opening prologue sounded. I just thought the voice sounded hokey and wooden, and I remember being almost numb to the entire movie at the time. It was just too damn noisy and didn't make sense, and had no ties to the other movies in any way that I could see. I didn't like the acting, I didn't like the look, I didn't like the setting of the main house. The score was pretty creepy sounding, but other than that, I was just not a fan of this movie at all. At least at that time. Oh, and I absolutely hated the portrayal of Leatherface in this movie. The look too, I thought it was horrible. The camo jacket, the oversized gloves, the brown pancake of his skin mask. I couldn't stand it. I remember renting it once, maybe twice more, between 98 and the early 2000s, but the film never really grew on me. Until recently, that is, but just barely. After a couple decades to step back, the film's faults have softened in my mind a bit, and I can sort of appreciate what the film is versus what it should have been a little better than I could before. Robert Jacks seemed like a really cool guy in real life, but I just hated this movie's Leatherface, and still do if we're being honest. Well, maybe hate's a strong word, but strongly dislike, let's just say that. The overt cross-dressing of Leatherface seems like an extreme response to his female masks and/or costumes of the first film, such as the granny or the pretty lady, but it fits the vibe of this film, and doesn't feel tacked in there for the sake of being there. Although I dislike the idea of the family being a weapon of horror controlled by the Illuminati, it was at least a bold choice, and I can respect that. I never want to see that concept again in the Chainsaw film, but I can respect it. Zellweger is good in her role, and McConaughey, as crazy and memorable and extreme as he is, really annoys the hell out of me in this movie. Just too much yelling and screaming. I think my dislike for this movie derives greatly from how damn repetitively noisy it is. And this is coming from a guy who loves a franchise of films where chainsaws are the predominant sound effect, and the chainsaw wasn't even the loudest or most annoying part of this movie. Look, I realize a ton of people love McConaughey in this movie, but it's just not for me. Props to the cast and crew for making something different though, and for trudging through the circus that was the making of this movie. Kim Henkel definitely worked his ass off to make this movie, and although I'm not the biggest fan, I can respect the fact that he got it done, and championed it from start to finish. And again, definitely not an unwatchable film, not in the slightest. Just not my cup of tea, but undeniably unique. The cameos by some of the original cast at the end was cool though. Also, I believe the murderous family on display within this film are actually the Slaughters, and not the Sawyers, but I'm not sure if that's explicitly exclusive, or if they're just another faction of the actual Sawyer clan. Again, big props to Kim Henkel, and rest in peace to Robert Jacks, who passed away in 2001. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, is passably average. From filmmaker Marcus Nispel comes the film that kickstarted the remake boom of the early to mid 2000s. A moderately budgeted horror flick with big production value and a Hollywood gloss that was unlike any of the entries that preceded it within the franchise, yet with a gritty and raw undertone that keeps the film from ever feeling like a run-of-the-mill early 2000s blockbuster. The 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Marcus Nispel and produced by the likes of Michael Bay, is one of those horror films that just leave a long-lasting impression on you. Was it a remake of what many, including myself, consider to be the holy grail of horror films? Yes, it was. But the fact that this movie is a reboot of that original film in no way affects that aforementioned long-lasting impression. This film really stands on its own and is a juggernaut in and of itself that is just packed with fantastic content. The fact that it's a remake never really comes into play within the film itself. Truly an all-new entity with an all-new attitude and identity comparatively to the original, all the while still finding ways to make little nods and callbacks to Tobe Hooper's classic 1974 film. We open with a tonally similar prologue, where the voice of John Larroquette, once again, informs the audience of the much-needed exposition regarding the subject matter and supposed true events of the film, which is a fantastic touch, and one that never really distracts from the film itself. Instead of an opening crawl, we instead get flashes of footage from the supposed actual crime scenes, which really enhances this artificial vibe that this film actually happened. We know we're in for a different film right from this opening sequence, because by showing us footage of the crime scene, the house where it all happened, and the authorities literally walking through the place, collecting evidence, we know full well that whatever happens in the film will eventually lead to these events, where police descend on the house, which is already itself a huge contrast to the original story and its first 2 or 3 sequels, where in that timeline, authorities were never able to actually make any arrests or even locate the house in the first place. Again, it's a little change, but one that really sets this film apart from the others right from the start. It's also important to note that authorities explicitly say the name Hewitt residence in Travis County, Texas, within this opening, letting audiences know this is not a Sawyer family story, nor is it one that takes place in or around the town of Newt. As the opening scene concludes, we flash back to August 18th, 1973, the same story date of the original film, but with a different cast of young characters, on their way to a Lynyrd Skynyrd concert on their way back from a trip to Mexico. There's still 5 of them, they're still around the same age as that original group, but instead of siblings visiting the remains of an old family homestead with their friends, these young adults are really just passing through this remote stretch of southern Texas. In this film, there is no Sally, no Franklin, no Kirk or Pam, and certainly no Jerry. In their place, we have Erin, played by Jessica Biel, who is this film's lead and the equivalent to her 1974 Sally Hardesty counterpart. We have Kemper, played by Eric Balfour, who is sort of this film's Jerry equivalent. We have Andy and Pepper, played respectively by Mike Vogel and Erica Learson, who are this movie's Pam and Kirk. And of course, we have the 5th member of the group, last but not least, Morgan, played by Jonathan Tucker, who isn't really the counterpart to Franklin from the original film. He's not Erin's brother, nor is he wheelchair-bound, but he's that 5th member of the group no less. Now, I have to make a statement about these characters, and I want to reinforce to you that this is coming from the mouth of somebody who absolutely loves the original film, considers it to be one of the best horror films of all time, and will defend that movie relentlessly. Here it goes. This remake boasts a better cast when it comes to the 5 main young adult characters. They're simply explored a bit more, have more likable personalities, and feel more like real people And that's not meant as a slight to the characters of the original film, or the actors who portrayed them. I love all those guys and gals. They were perfect for that film. But let me put it to you like this. Who would you rather hang out with, or travel across the country with? I'm gonna go with the remake cast. But that's just me. After some banter about destiny, some factual information about STDs, and a small argument about buying weed in Mexico, the gang soon runs into this film's new version of the hitchhiker by almost running her over. After failing to truly make contact with her, but knowing she's badly in need of help, the gang decides to give her a lift to wherever she needs to go, which I would assume to be the hospital if I was in their shoes, but whatever. The hitchhiker, played to perfection by Lauren German, weirds out the gang, but this time not by taking photos or talking about head cheese or trying to slice them open with razor blades, but instead about the horrible man she claims to have just escaped from, and that they're going the wrong way. After she lunges for the steering wheel and tells them that they're all going to die, the young woman pulls a pistol from underneath her dress, seemingly from, well, you know where, and proceeds to blow her damn head off right there on the spot, blowing a brain-laced hole right through the back of the van window, petrifying our ragtag gang of pot-smoking concert-goers. This scene alone really sets the vibe and tone of the film from here on out, and lets us as the audience sort of know what to expect from its remainder, and also lets those of us who knew the original film that things were not going to play out in the same way as the '74 classic. After the expected squabble between the characters regarding what to do with this dead girl now that she's thrown a big wrench in their concert plans, the gang soon decides to head into town and see about leaving her with the proper authorities in hopes of salvaging their day and still somehow making it to the concert. After stopping at a local mom and pop, the characters meet an elderly shop owner named Mrs. Luda May, played by the late and great Marietta Merrick, who dials the sheriff for them and tells them to meet him at the old mill. The gang, naturally, feels really weirded out about driving even further across town with this dead chick in their van. But what are you gonna do, right? If the sheriff says the old mill, then you drive to the old mill. Nothing suspicious about this request, or the demeanor of Luda May at all. Nothing to worry about. I think we need to take a moment and just bask in how glorious the cinematography and set design in this film is. Not only is the production design team going beast mode on the locations and set dressings and all that stuff, but the man, myth, and legend, cinematographer Daniel Pearl, is pulling no punches when it comes to the look of this film. Rich and desaturated and contrasty and just, it looks almost like a gritty oil painting come to life. And for those of you that don't know, Daniel Pearl also shot the original 1974 film. Talk about a crazy full circle, huh? The sheriff, assumingly running late, doesn't show up until quite some time after the gang first arrives at the mill. In the meantime, they encounter some angry possums and a filthy little boy called Jedediah, played by David Dorfman, who insists to them that the sheriff is at home getting drunk. After finding a jarred photo of the hitchhiker, Aaron and Kemper decide to trudge off into the woods, intent on finding the sheriff's house, leaving Morgan, Andy, Pepper, and Jedediah back at the mill. Kemper and Aaron soon run into an enormous, aging plantation-style house and meet an elderly amputee named Old Monty, played by Terrence Evans, who agrees to let Aaron use the phone as long as Kemper remains outside. Monty dials the sheriff for her, how polite of him, and proceeds to go and empty his urine out into the toilet while she does so, before, of course, needing help from the young woman, who goes to his aid only to be groped by the old man as she does so. Kemper, having enough of the waiting, decides to go into the house himself and takes a look around, coming across filthy room after filthy room, before finally ending up in a small bedroom where a TV set plays old cartoons at extremely high volume. It's here that stuff really hits the fan, and in an abrupt way, not unlike the original film, we get our very first look at remake Leatherface, coming out of nowhere with a sledgehammer and absolutely decimating Kemper with it, before aggressively dragging his twitching body off into the basement and, in full tribute to the original film, slamming shut the giant slaughterhouse metal door. I remember everybody in the theater jumping in this scene when Leatherface first shows up, back in 2003. And although it plays differently, it was probably equally shocking to the first time Leatherface showed up in the 74 film. Abrupt, out of nowhere, visceral, and truly frightening. Back at the mill, Jedediah is chased off by Andy after poking the corpse with a stick, and soon thereafter, Sheriff Hoyt arrives on scene, here to save the day, played brilliantly by Arlie Ermey, in surely one of his best roles ever, and one of the highlights of both this movie and its 2006 prequel. After some hilariously dark banter and some truly crazy lines of dialogue, the boys help the sheriff wrap up, with saran wrap no less, the dead body of the hitchhiker, before proceeding to stuff her into his trunk. The happy sheriff bids them farewell, reinforces his oath to protect and serve, and drives the hell out of there. Aaron returns to the mill, looking for Kemper, assuming he must have returned by now, but realizes he's nowhere to be found. Andy agrees to go back to the house with Aaron in hopes of finding Kemper. After storming the house and finding nothing, Andy and Kemper soon face off against an angry Monty, who quickly calls forth the terrifying, monstrously sized Leatherface, going full Leatherface mode and chasing them out of the house with his chainsaw at full bore. He manages to slice off one of Andy's legs, dragging him back into the house as Aaron makes her terrified escape back toward the mill yet again. Leatherface is scary in this movie, and he seems less like a man suffering from some kind of mental illness, as he was in the first 4 films, and more like somebody who is simply angry with the world and full of some kind of indescribable rage, because this Leatherface is smart, cunning, seems to enjoy what he does. Even if this version still doesn't talk, there's something more on purpose about him than the other versions. After salting Andy's wounds and hanging him on a meat hook, Leatherface begins constructing a new mask from Kemper's own face, revealing his skin-diseased, riddled face beneath as he takes off the mask for a quick breather, the only time this really ever happens out of the entire franchise. Back at the mill, Morgan and Pepper are attempting to clean up the van, only to have a horrified Aaron return, telling them that they need to leave immediately. Before they can get the hell out of there, Hoyt returns, the good old sheriff he is, and finds the remnants of a joint in the van, ignoring all their pleas for help, and instead forcing them to the ground outside, as the criminals they are. Damn marijuana-smoking kids. Hoyt eventually takes Morgan into his car, after interrogating him in the back of the van, of course, and driving away from the mill, leaving Aaron and Pepper behind. But they won't be alone for long, as Leatherface, garbed in an all-new skin mask, shows up to keep them company, killing Pepper in cold blood and proceeding to stare at Aaron through the cut-out eye sockets of her very dead boyfriend, in what plays out as an extremely morbid and shocking exchange. After a chase sequence through the woods, Aaron comes upon a trailer owned by a woman named the Tea Lady, played gloriously by Kathy Lampkin, and a younger woman named Henrietta, played by Heather Kafka, who gives her tea that has been laced with some kind of drug. After discovering that the baby being held by Henrietta is actually the same baby from the submerged photo of the hitchhiker found earlier, Aaron tells Henrietta that the baby is not hers, but then proceeds to completely pass out in full blackout mode. Leatherface, his mother Luda May, Sheriff Hoyt, and Old Monty all greet Aaron at the Hewitt house as she awakes from her drug-induced nap. Luda May explains to Aaron that Leatherface suffered from a skin disease that disfigured his face, and that kids like her and her friends never treated Thomas, which is revealed to be the actual name of Leatherface in this continuity, with anything other than cruelty and ridicule. Although cannibalism itself doesn't really seem to be the blatant reason for this family's actions in this film, it remains a sort of subtext, hinted at here and there, especially with Monty's line,
"Maybe she'd like to stay for supper."
Judging by Leatherface's salting Andy's wounds earlier, I think we can all assume that Aaron and her friends are all items on the menu at this point. Aaron is soon dumped into the basement by Thomas, where she reunites with Andy, and after failing to help him off of the meat hooks, she begrudgingly kills him in a pity kill, much to the relief and request of Andy himself, which is a scene that actually plays quite morbid, morose, and extremely sad for the characters involved. It's actually a very powerful scene considering the type of film this is. Morgan is found handcuffed in a bathtub afterwards, and to their surprise, they encounter the young Jedediah once again, leading them both out of the house, but not before an angered Leatherface notices and begins chasing them, chainsaw in hand. Jedediah distracts Thomas long enough for them to escape into the woods, where they soon come across an abandoned shack and they barricade themselves inside. Naturally, Aaron is discovered by Leatherface, but Morgan attacks him, only to be hung by his handcuffs from a chandelier. Leatherface then cuts through him vertically, from groin to sternum, leaving Aaron as the sole survivor of this night of terror. After finding a slaughterhouse and a fantastically tense chase through the bowels of it, Aaron finally gets the drop on Leatherface, chopping off one of his arms with a disgusting old meat cleaver and leaving the skin-masked madman to wallow in the slaughterhouse in sheer agony. Aaron runs outside and flags down a trucker, played by Brad Leland, who willingly helps her into the truck and is eager to find her medical attention. But after Aaron pulls the same nonsense as the hitchhiker from earlier, by trying to forcibly steer the direction of the truck away from the town, the angry and shocked trucker stops to find help at the gas station, the very same station from earlier that day, and one where Luda May and Hoyt, coincidentally, are enjoying the company of the baby along with Henrietta. When the trucker bursts in talking about this crazed girl, the group heads outside, leaving the baby inside. At this point, Aaron sneaks the baby out of the station and places the baby in the sheriff's car. She hotwires the car, and as Hoyt approaches the vehicle, she runs him over repeatedly until he is very, very, very dead. Leatherface suddenly appears in the road and slashes at the car with his chainsaw, but Aaron manages to escape with the baby, and he watches in frustration as she drives away, not dancing in the streets in a frenzied rage, but simply staring intently and silently. 2 days later, 2 investigating officers are killed by Leatherface while doing a crime scene investigation of the Hewitt house, the same investigation and walkthrough we saw snippets of during the opening prologue of the film, with John Larroquette, naturally, closing out the film with some concluding narration as we see the supposedly only known image of Thomas Hewitt, the man they call Leatherface. This film was absolutely hardcore, and unlike so many Wonder Bread remakes of today, this film wasn't afraid to be downright dirty, gory, disgusting, and absolutely unapologetic in tone. The cast and crew did a phenomenal job with this movie, and again, it really does stand on its own as another rendition of the original story, without simply being known as the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was a huge hit for New Line Cinema and Platinum Dunes back in 2003, and it's become even more successful and has garnered an even bigger cult following in the nearly 2 decades since. It's hard to believe it's been that long, wow. But again, this film deserves all of the praise in the world. It's a juggernaut of a horror movie, a fantastic entry in the franchise overall, and definitely in the top 3 or 4 of the series overall, and it gave us a truly frightening Leatherface. I also think a lot of the visceral horror of this film comes from its presentation as this true story, much like the first film, but since we actually see quote-unquote real footage in the bookends of this film, with different names and settings over the original, I think this helped sell the film to people in this weird, oh, this is the real story the original film was based on kind of way, if that makes any sense, even though it's no more real than the '74 film. Big props to everyone involved in this movie, especially to cinematographer Daniel Pearl, composer Steve Jablonsky, who killed it with the original score in this movie. Also, Andrew Bernarski absolutely killed it as Leatherface in this movie too. And of course, director Marcus Nispel, who absolutely nailed this remake. Rest in peace to R. Lee Ermey, Terrence Evans, Marietta Merrick, and Kathy Lampkin. And apologies if I'm saying these names incorrectly. Also, the production of this movie took place in Texas, as did the 2006 prequel, so that's a good return to form for the series. No California, no Louisiana, Texas. where a chainsaw film should be filmed. With that said, Marcus Nispel's 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a masterpiece. From filmmaker Jonathan Leibsman comes the 2006 Chainsaw film that actually serves as the prequel to the 2003 remake, exploring the backstory of the Hewitt family and, of course, Thomas Hewitt himself, the man they call Leatherface. Existing within the franchise as one of two prequels, both set in different continuities, the 2006 endeavor would be a moderate hit during its theatrical run, but has gone on to become one of the franchise's most beloved entries, amassing an enormous cult following over the last decade and a half. But how does this film stack up against this 2003 predecessor? And is it worthy enough to call itself a prequel to that movie? Let's find out with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning. This is actually the second Chainsaw film that I ever got to see in theaters, because I didn't exist for the first and second film, was seeing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in theaters in 1990 versus Leatherface, was nowhere near any of the limited showings of Next Generation, if there even were any in Florida at that time, and it wasn't until I was 16 in 2003 that I finally got to see Leatherface on the big screen. So you can probably imagine how stoked I was for the second theatrical experience regarding the skin-masked madman, a prequel to the 2003 film that brought back all of the Hewitt family members, including all of their respective actors. I mean, nobody was recast in this film, which was a huge deal at the time. Also returning to the role of Leatherface himself was Andrew Bernarski, who absolutely killed it in the 2003 film, so I think there was an air of excitement about the film, especially regarding Leatherface and the return of Bernarski to the role. To date, the only guy to ever play the character twice, if I'm not mistaken. Marcus Nispel would not be returning for this go-around, neither would cinematographer Daniel Pearl. But with the same producing team, including but not limited to Michael Bay, I had a hunch that we were in good hands, and the trailer made us all the more confident in the film, as it showcased a fantastic story, simple but fantastic. The cinematography looked rich, those orange and yellows were definitely dialed up for this movie, helping to sell the back-in-the-day nostalgia vibe of the prequel itself, and the new cast of young, soon-to-be-dead characters was also promising. All in all, I was absolutely on board with this movie, excited for this movie, and we had our asses in theaters opening night, with a packed theater. One of the last old-school style packed house theater experiences I actually remember enjoying. But could the movie really live up to the 2003 remake? And if so, could it surpass it? As the lights dimmed and the movie began, we held our collective breaths and watched. In 1939, a woman named Sloane, played by L.A. Calkins, dies while giving birth prematurely in a Texas slaughterhouse, and the supervisor, played by Tim DeZarn, disposes of the baby by leaving him in a dumpster, when young Luda Mae Hewitt, played by Allison Merrick, the real-life daughter of Marietta Merrick, finds the child. She takes him back to the Hewitt residence, names him Thomas, and raises him as her own son. 30 years later, Thomas, played gloriously by Andrew Bernarski, works in the slaughterhouse under the same supervisor who left him in the dumpster. Whether or not he is aware of this fact is never stated. When the plant is shut down by the health department, he refuses to leave until the supervisor tries to force him off the grounds. Thomas soon murders his supervisor and finds a chainsaw, which he takes with him for whatever reason. When Sheriff Hoyt, the actual Sheriff Hoyt, played by Lou Temple, attempts to arrest him, Charlie Hewitt, played by Arlie Ermey, shoots him and assumes his identity, becoming the Sheriff Hoyt we know from the 2003 film. Meanwhile, brothers Eric, played by Matt Bomer, and Dean, played by Taylor Hanley, are driving across the country with their girlfriends, Chrissy, played by Jordana Brewster, and Bailey, played by Deora Baird, to enlist in the Vietnam War. At a diner, they run into a biker gang, one of whom follows them on her motorcycle, a biker chick played by Melody Chase. She threatens them with a shotgun and orders the group to pull over. In the ensuing chaos, the car crashes, and Chrissy is thrown into a field. When Hoyt arrives, he quickly kills the biker chick and makes them put her body in his car. He then calls for Uncle Monty, still played by Terrence Evans, legs and all, to tow the Jeep, the same Jeep Chrissy happens to be hiding in. Hoyt drives the group to the Hewitt house, where he has Thomas butcher the biker's body. Chrissy runs to the highway and flags down Holden, the biker's boyfriend, played by Lee Tergesen, and they return to the house together. Hoyt tortures Dean after finding out that he was going to forgo the Vietnam War draft. When Hoyt leaves, Eric breaks free from his restraints and gets Dean to safety before sneaking into the house to free Bailey. Bailey escapes in Monty's truck, but Thomas stabs her with a meat hook and drags her back into the house. Dean gets caught in a bear trap, and Hoyt knocks Eric unconscious. Holden and Chrissy part ways to search for their friends. While Chrissy finds Dean, Holden takes Hoyt hostage. Thomas then straps Eric to a wooden table and slices up the nerves in both of his arms. Hoyt calls out for Thomas for help, and he cuts Holden in half with a chainsaw. Chrissy finds Eric in the basement, but is unable to free him, and hides underneath the table when Thomas returns. Thomas then proceeds to kill Eric with the chainsaw, and skins his face and wears it as a mask. Chrissy is about to flee when she hears Bailey screaming from inside, and decides to save her. She finds her upstairs, but Hoyt catches her and brings her downstairs for dinner, along with Bailey and an unconscious Dean. Leatherface slits Bailey's throat and tries to take Chrissy to the basement, but she stabs him in the back with a screwdriver and jumps out of a window. Dean regains consciousness and savagely beats Hoyt before heading off to find Chrissy. Chrissy enters the slaughterhouse, grabs a knife, and cuts Leatherface's face, but he overpowers her. Dean intervenes, but Leatherface kills him with a chainsaw. Chrissy escapes, hijacks an abandoned car, and drives off. She soon sees a state trooper and a pulled-over pedestrian, but as she drives towards them, intending to pull over, Leatherface appears in the back seat and impales her with a chainsaw, causing her to lose control and crash into the trooper and the pedestrian, killing them both. Leatherface walks along the road back towards the Hewitt house, and the narration of John Larroquette closes out the film. What a hell of a way to end a movie. All seems well for our heroine Chrissy, and then just as she's about to make it to safety, you start to scratch your head and think, wait, by the time we see the events of 1974 in the 2003 film, that's the first time a survivor ever got away, so technically, nobody can survive this movie. And then boom, Leatherface, somehow, jumps up from the back seat and destroys Chrissy. And I guess we can either assume that either the Hewitts came back out there later and cleaned up the crime scene, or, if it was found by authorities, never linked it to the Hewitts until after they were discovered as the Travis County Butchers after the events of the 2003 film. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning is one of those rare examples of a prequel film that works. It had a good pace, a nice flow, the cast all brought their A-games, the set pieces and locations were just as rich as the 2003 movie, if not a little more self-contained. The cinematography was fantastic and rich, the editing was on point, the original score by a returning Steve Jablonsky was just as good as the first, if not better, and the filmmakers and producers and crew members involved in this project should all feel very proud of this movie. This movie rocked the house too as far as that theatrical experience was concerned. Not as much fun as the 2003 screening, but damn fun nonetheless. Again, one of the last big great horror movie theatrical experiences I've had, which is kind of sad considering how long ago this was at this point. My only real gripes about the film, if you want to call them gripes, are the conveniences that were neatly tied up in this movie. And what I mean by that is, the film showcases a lot of stuff from the 2003 film, but explains how said stuff began in this film, within the context of the story's time frame. Basically, all of this stuff happened within the 24-hour period that this movie takes place across, such as Monty losing his legs, Hoyt getting his teeth busted out, Leatherface making his first chainsaw kill ever, his first human skin mask ever, etc. Again, these aren't so much gripes as they are observations, but maybe just a little too convenient for the timeline of this film. But then again, I get it. They wanted to tell this story. And it's not bad. It all works in the context of the film. It just seems like the timing of all that stuff was very close to each other. As far as Leatherface's skin mask is concerned, it's definitely one of the freshest ones in the series. And by that, I don't mean fresh as in cool, I mean fresh as in like recently cut off somebody's face, like fresh skin. And it's definitely one of the most realistic looking masks as well. Not one of my personal favorites, but damn good nonetheless. The dog muzzle style face mask is also pretty freaky too, which I believe is actually made from a dog in the film. And although it's not per se a Leatherface style Leatherface mask, it's a great origin for what it goes on to become. Bernowski crushed it again in the role as well. This dude is just scary in the role. Big, mean, imposing, and built like a damn freight train. This is the Leatherface that just goes through you if he has to, regardless of whether or not he even has a chainsaw. Not as macabre or as frightening as Gunnar Hansen's version, but definitely bigger and more of a physical threat as far as size and stature goes. Again, not to take anything away from Gunnar Hansen at all. He was a huge guy as well, and definitely is the scariest version of the character, but Bernowski has a quick intensity about his movements, and feels like an unstoppable object while in motion. Leatherface here doesn't look as cool as he did in the 2003 film, but you can see the lineage. You can feel the same performance in the costume, and it's cool having the same Leatherface across multiple films, even if it was just a brief era of the franchise. I'm really stoked to see how big this movie has become with its cult following over the years, and I think it's absolutely well deserved. Props to director Jonathan Leifsman, who made a fantastic Chainsaw prequel. With that said, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning, is a masterpiece. From filmmaker Joseph Luesenhop comes the 2013 entry in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise that really began the weirder era of the franchise, and is not only known for being the first chainsaw requel of the series, but a film that also marked the beginning of the last decade's explosion of requel films in general, disregarding every other film in the franchise aside from the 1974 original. Way before Halloween 2018 ever did it with that franchise, the world was introduced to Joseph Luesenhop's Texas Chainsaw. Known as Texas Chainsaw 3D during its initial release, Texas Chainsaw was surfing that dying wave of 3D horror. And let me just say that I am not a fan of 3D movies or watching 3D movies in 3D. I just find it distracting and I don't like the look most of the time. I don't want to have to wear those glasses and so on and so forth. I'm not a fan. So naturally, when we saw this film in theaters, we grabbed a 2D showing of the film to avoid all of that nonsense. And luckily, the film still looked okay enough as a standard film. I mean, of course, there's the usual handful of wonky looking shots that you can just tell were made for 3D effect. But other than that, it doesn't really take you out of the film. The film itself acts as a direct sequel to the 1974 original, and nixes every other franchise installment from existence besides that first film. Years before Halloween 2018 did this, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise was already in full requel mode. Although names carry over from 1986's Chainsaw 2, such as the Sawyer family namesake, a namesake actually not introduced in the 74 film, there really is nothing else on display within this film besides the aforementioned continuity of the original. No callbacks or homages or anything nodding to the other entries. 3D plays it pretty much straight as the only other film in the series, besides Tobe Hooper's classic, which is a pretty bold move for a movie like this when you think about how revered a film that first sequel was. Sort of similar to Halloween 2018, wiping Halloween 2 out of existence entirely. A bold move indeed. A stupid move on both accounts, because Halloween 2 and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 are scary cinematic gold, but bold nonetheless. It's worth noting that Texas Chainsaw was actually written by Jason Goes to Hell writer-director Adam Marcus, along with his wife, Deborah Sullivan, who crafted a story around the events of the original film, and specifically, what happened directly after Sally's escape, where the Sawyer family must not only deal with the encroaching authorities, but also the frenzied and lynch mob-esque townsfolk of Newt, the town where the story takes place. With that said, I'd like to preemptively point out that in Adam's original script, the movie was to take place in the 90s, 20 years after the events of the original, which would have made perfect sense regarding the age of Heather Miller, as well as Leatherface himself. The producers are really the ones who updated the film and brought it into the contemporary year of 2013, which technically makes it 4 decades after the first film, which absolutely makes no sense within the context of the film. And that's why the actual date of the first film is not explicitly shown, nor are the date of deaths on the tombstones of the Sawyer family members explicitly shown. They're actually covered up by very convenient overgrowth. I think Adam Marcus gets a lot of misdirected hate about these aspects of the film, and while I do think they work against the film and are a flat-out detriment to it as a whole, these things are really not the fault of Adam Marcus or the other writers involved. The producers probably just wanted to have a modern film to appeal to the so-called modern audiences as much as possible, which has always been one of the dumbest things I hear studios and producers say, as if no modern kid is going to not go see a film if it's not set in modern times. If those kind of people actually exist, they're probably not going to pay to go see the movie anyway. So just tell the story you want to tell and stop worrying about having everything be modern. But no. They wanted smartphones and rap music and all that contemporary stuff in this movie. Timeline be damned. Also, when it comes to these two questionable lines,
Do your thing, cuz.
And
Welcome to Texas, motherfucker!
I think those were lines added in by the producers. And again, not things that were a part of the original script. So take that how you will. I'd also like to point out that this movie filmed in Louisiana this time, not Texas, which is kind of weird, but better than California, and better than Bulgaria, that's for sure. Following the events of the original film, the town sheriff, played by Tom Barry, arrives at the Sawyer house demanding for Leatherface to surrender. The family initially refuses, but eventually comply. The crazed townsfolk of Newt, however, led by a man named Bert Hartman, played by Paul Ray, soon arrive on scene and end up burning down the Sawyer farmhouse in an act of vigilante justice. The arsonists are proclaimed heroes of the community, and the entire Sawyer family is thought to have been killed. However, an infant with a burn mark on her chest is found by one of the townsmen, Gavin Miller, played by David Bourne, who promptly murders her dying mother, Loretta Sawyer, played by Dottie Brow. Gavin and his wife Arlene, played by Sue Rock, take the child into their care and raise her as their own daughter. This was actually a pretty intense opening to the movie, with not only a very stylish recap of the 1974 film playing atop the actual opening credits, but a pretty hardcore and mean-spirited series of events once we catch up to the arrival of the sheriff on site, after Sally's escape. Credit where credit's due, Bill Moseley does an awesome job channeling the spirit of Jim Seedow as Drayton Sawyer, and this really does feel like an organic continuation of the 1974 film. Leatherface, still garbed in his Pretty Woman attire and played by Sam McKenzie, does a pretty good job as a frightened and bewildered psychopath, mourning the loss of his brother, the hitchhiker, whose body lies on the table beside him. If you look closely, you can see the body of the truck driver from the first film as well, alluding to the fact that he did not make it out of the situation alive. Grandpa, looking a bit more alive in this sequence than how he did for the entirety of the first film, is actually played yet again by John Dugan. And how cool is that, huh? The highlight of this cannibal family reunion, however, is the appearance of the late and great Gunnar Hansen himself, this time playing a man named Boss Sawyer, who sort of acts as the quiet patriarch of the family, because it does seem like Drayton takes orders from him and not the other way around. There's also a slew of other Sawyers in this house as well, who must have all come to the house after realizing somebody got away. There's Bear Sawyer, played by David Bell, the aforementioned Loretta Sawyer, and 3 other unnamed Sawyers, who I simply couldn't find the names of, character or actor-wise. But there's 2 men and 1 woman, with one of the men I assume to be the partner of Loretta and the father of baby Edith, who later comes to be known as Heather. Many years later, a grown-up Heather, portrayed by Alexandra Daddario, receives a letter informing her that her grandmother, Verna Sawyer Carson, has passed away, much to her surprise. When she confronts her parents about it, she discovers that she was adopted from a family in Newt, Texas, something she sort of always wondered about, but never knew for sure until this point. Against her adopted parents' wishes, Heather, her boyfriend Ryan, played by Trey Songz, her best friend Nikki, played by Tanya Ramond, and Nikki's boyfriend Kenny, played by Kiram Malaki Sanchez, and I'm probably butchering these names, travel to her grandmother's home to collect her inheritance. Along the way, the group picks up a hitchhiker named Daryl, played by Sean Sipos, who Heather is suspicious of right from the start. But regardless, the team presses on. Upon arriving at the property, Heather is given a letter from Verna's lawyer, Farnsworth, played by Richard Reel, and is explicitly told to read said letter before entering the house, which of course, she neglects to do. As the group explores the house, they decide to stay the night and party it out in celebration. I mean, Heather just inherited a full-blown mansion. What's not to celebrate? The gang decides to head out into town and retrieve food and party supplies, leaving hitchhiker Daryl behind to look after the house. Expectedly, Daryl begins stealing valuables and intends on fleeing the scene before they get back, but instead discovers a mysterious metal door in the wine cellar that he is unable to open. And as he tries to enter, he is killed by an aging Leatherface, now played by Dan Yeager, who does an excellent job in the role and really does seem to channel Gunnar Hansen's performance from the original. While grocery shopping, it's revealed that Nikki and Ryan have been sleeping together. Heather meets Deputy Carl, played by Scott Eastwood, and his father Bert Hartman, who is now the mayor of Newt. Bert tries and fails to buy the house outright from Heather upon learning her namesake, but she refuses, and from this point on it's clear that the mayor is going to be trouble. Heather and her friends return to find the house ransacked, but decide to celebrate regardless after learning that not much has been taken. While Kenny is preparing dinner, he goes downstairs to the cellar, where Leatherface impales him on a hook and drags him back down the stairs. Nikki tricks Ryan into going outside to the barn, seduces him, and the two end up getting it on once again. Meanwhile, Heather finds the decomposing body of her Aunt Verna upstairs, and soon encounters Leatherface in the kitchen thereafter. But after being knocked out by the skin-masked madman and waking up in the basement, she manages to make her escape while he kills Kenny with a chainsaw, cutting the man clean in half. Heather runs to the Carson Sawyer graveyard outside and hides in Verna's coffin, which Leatherface soon saws through. Nikki and Ryan draw the attention of Leatherface, while Heather gets in the van and picks up her friends. Using a chainsaw, Leatherface ends up cutting through one of the tires, which causes the van to crash, killing Ryan on impact. After wounding Nikki, he then chases Heather to a nearby carnival, where Deputy Carl is patrolling the grounds. While at the police department, Heather begins digging through the files of the Sawyer family and learns of the family's murderous history and how they were killed, and the sheriff and Hartman send an officer to investigate the Carson estate. Over the phone, the officer reports his findings. He finds Nikki hiding in a freezer, but accidentally shoots her in the head before he himself is killed by Leatherface. Leatherface skins the flesh from the officer's cadaver and uses it to create a new flesh mask. Enraged by the officer's findings, Hartman vows to end the remaining Sawyers. Heather leaves the station and meets with her lawyer at a bar. He tells her that Leatherface is her cousin, who actually survived the original burning of the Sawyer family farmhouse. Heather escapes the bar when Hartman finds her and runs into Deputy Carl in his patrol car. As they drive away, Carl reveals himself as Bert's son, a fact unknown to Heather up until this point. He kidnaps her, takes her to an old slaughterhouse, ties her up, and gags her. Listening over the deceased officer's police radio, Leatherface learns of Heather's location and goes to the slaughterhouse to kill her. Before he is able to do so, he sees the quote-unquote birthmark on her chest, which is actually a burned impression of the Sawyer family crest that her mother was wearing at the time of her death, and he instead removes her gag. Heather tells him that she is his long-lost cousin, and, shocked and bewildered, he quickly releases her. Leatherface is then attacked from behind by Hartman and his friend Ollie, played by Richie Montgomery. As Hartman and Ollie prepare to kill Leatherface by throwing him into the meat grinder, Heather kills Ollie and tosses Leatherface's chainsaw.
Do your thing, cuz.
In the struggle, the sheriff arrives but hesitates to stop Leatherface from killing Bert. Leatherface uses his chainsaw to force Hartman to his horrible death in the bowels of the meat grinder. The sheriff decides to let Heather and Leatherface go, telling them to clean up the mess. Afterwards, Leatherface and Heather return to the Carson estate, where Heather reads the letter from Verna, played by none other than Marilyn Burns herself. The letter informs her that her real name is Edith Rose Sawyer, that Jedediah, her cousin, aka Leatherface, lives in the basement behind the metal door, and that he will protect her for the rest of his life. But it also requests that she take care of him in return. Also, note that this version of Jedediah is in no way related to the Jedediah of the 2003 film. Leatherface finally buries Verna's body, poetically signaling that he now accepts Heather as the new matriarch of the family and head of the household. Heather accepts how Leatherface's mental state and upbringing drove him to commit his original crimes, and ends up graciously accepting him as her only family. In a post-credits scene, Heather's adopted parents show up at the Carson estate to visit Heather, intending on greedily splitting her assets. As they wait at the front door, Leatherface comes through the door with his chainsaw in hand, presumably killing the two scumbags right there on the spot. All in all, I enjoyed this movie, timeline inconsistencies aside. I thought the story was pretty good, and although nothing will ever beat out the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 as the ultimate sequel to the original, this requel works quite well as a direct follow-up to the original story, if you can divorce yourself from the idea that Chainsaw 2 exists. The cast and crew deserves to be proud of this film, whether or not it's grown better or worse with fans in the years since. The production design did a great job, the special effects, although not as polished or extravagant as some of the other Chainsaws, were all very good, and the cast, specifically Daddario, Yeager, and Ray, were excellent in the film, and they all felt believable. Again, not to keep beating a dead horse, but my biggest problems with this film are the aforementioned timeline issues. This film should have been set in the 90s, not the 2010s, and there should have been no smart technology or modern rap music or anything contemporary of 2013. If they had to set it in modern times, then Daddario's character should have been the daughter of the baby seen in the 1973 flashback, and not the baby herself, therefore getting rid of the character needing to be in her 40s by the time we meet her. It would just instead be her daughter that the story focuses on. But alas, we didn't get that. I can look past these faults though, because those faults aside, the movie is a quick-paced, exposition-filled horror movie that tells its story, fleshes out its main characters, feels like it could be the same world as the 74 film. Also, it was awesome seeing Marilyn Burns, John Dugan, and Gunnar Hansen in this movie. Talk about a Chainsaw reunion. Big props to Bill Moseley as well, who did a great job as Drayton Sawyer, and a big rest in peace to the legends Marilyn Burns and Gunnar Hansen, staples of the original film and horror itself. Rest in peace. I'm just gonna say it. As far as Chainsaw requels go, this movie does a better job telling a fully fleshed out story than the 2022 film, which in and of itself is a requel to the first film. And while this movie is riddled with those previously mentioned timeline issues, Texas Chainsaw 3D still manages to be the better film overall when it comes to the Battle of the Chainsaw requels. Joseph Lewison-Hopps' Texas Chainsaw is worthy of a rewatch. From filmmakers Julian Maury and Alexandra Bustillo comes the 2017 Chainsaw prequel that, continuity-wise, acts as a direct prequel to the original 1974 film, as well as the 2013 requel, Texas Chainsaw, filled with names and characters that not only appear in the 74 film, but also the 2013 film, forming a sort of subset trilogy within the overall franchise. The question is this a worthy enough film to justify its place as a prequel to the 74 classic, or does it fall flat on its saw blade? Let's take a look at Leatherface. I had mixed feelings about this project when it was first announced back in 2015 or 14, or whenever it was, because I was very much still faulting the previous film, Texas Chainsaw, for its blatant continuity and timeline issues regarding its connection to the original film. And knowing that this film was going to expand the world explored in the 2013 movie, and was being produced by many of the same people, I was a little put off by its announcement. It didn't even matter that I overall enjoyed the 2013 effort. I hadn't really warmed up to it yet to the point that I am today, where I can look past those timeline issues and simply watch the movie. I just wasn't all the way there yet. Also, the fact that this film was shooting in Bulgaria seemed really weird to me, just downright strange. I mean, at least shoot it in Louisiana, as the last film did, or better yet, in Texas, as the 2003 and 2006 films had. Something about not shooting a horror movie that is a part of a seminal all-American horror franchise in the USA just feels off. Does it work for a lot of films? Yes. But this is a story that takes place in Texas. You shoot this in Texas, or at least Louisiana, or California, if you have to. But alas, we have a Bulgaria chainsaw. But you have to hand it to the filmmakers to some extent, because the way they justified the visuals of the Bulgarian mountains and stuff like that is that maybe this story takes place in West Texas, which upon review is very mountainous and similar looking to Bulgaria, at least as far as the locations used in this movie are concerned. Again, odd choice nonetheless, because this is a prequel to the 74 film, which was supposed to take place way down in South Texas, not West Texas. But I digress. It is what it is at this point, am I right? Once we finally got the news that the movie would not be getting a theatrical release, instead becoming a direct-TV release, which was an extremely weird choice at the time and remains one to this day, I was a little worried about the film. Why don't they believe in this movie enough for a theatrical run? All those questions arose, and after seeing the trailer, I felt a little bit better about the project, because what I saw on display looked really good. The fact that Stephen Dorff and Lily Taylor were in the film was a big bonus, and the story itself seemed really cool, and really different in tone over the 2006 prequel to the remake. Needless to say, my interest was piqued, and in October of 2017, we were treated to one of the most highly debated entries of the Chainsaw franchise. In 1955, couple Betty Hartman and Ted Hardesty, played respectively by Lorena Kambarov and Julian Kostov, and apologies now because I'm going to butcher all of these names, are driving down a country road when they come across the seemingly wounded child, Jedediah Sawyer, played by Boris Kabaczewski. an unrelated character to the Jedediah from the 2003 film, by the way. In an attempt to help him, Betty follows him to a dilapidated barn, where she is promptly killed by his murderous and sadistic family. Her father, Sheriff Hartman, played by a badass Stephen Dorff, who is notably the father of Bert Hartman from the 2013 film, is called to the crime scene, where he is shocked to find his daughter deceased. Despite the efforts of matriarch Verna Sawyer, played in glorious fashion by Lily Taylor, Hartman responds by taking Jedediah into custody as retribution against the Sawyers, sending him to a mental institution known as the Gorman House Youth Reformatory. Before we proceed further, I'd like to point out how good of an opening scene this film has. Not only does it showcase young Jed's birthday, where he refuses to kill the man he's instructed to with a gifted chainsaw from his mother, we actually see Grandpa Sawyer, played by Edward Parsian, alive enough and young enough to actually kill someone with a sledgehammer. Talk about epic. Now, for those who know, and if you don't know, why are you watching this review? As far as the film's later twist is concerned, I'm not a big fan of that twist. And although this birthday sequence reinforces the dynamic of the character, Jed, as a once decently good person before his later de-evolution into Leatherface, by showing him not wanting to kill the man in this scene, I would have preferred no twist at all. For Jed to just be Leatherface all along, and for him to just have killed the guy with the chainsaw without hesitation. But that's just me. I feel like I could have explained that in a much simpler way. Anyways, if you look around the room, you'll see not only Drayton Sawyer, played by Demo Alexiev, but a very young Nubbins, aka the Hitchhiker, played by Risto Malev. It's also awesome to see the house from the first movie rebuilt yet again, after the first reproduction was burned down in 3D. You just have to get used to those mountains in the distance this time around. 10 years later at the Gorman House, where inmates are renamed to avoid their dangerous families, Nurse Elizabeth White, played by Vanessa Grassi, forms a bond with a boy named Jackson, played by Sam Strike. Verna later shows up to the institution with an injunction to allow family visitation, only to be rejected by the director of the facility, Dr. Lang, played by Christopher Adamson. On the way out, she violates security, causing an escape riot, in which many of the nurses and patients are killed. Elizabeth is saved by Jackson, who gets her outside with fellow inmate Bud, played by Sam Coleman, where they are taken hostages by escapees Ike and Clarice, played respectively by James Blore and Jessica Madsen. I'd like to also point out that the character of Bud seems like the obvious version of grown-up Jed. Because of his demeanor and apparent mental issues, this legitimately seems like it could be youthful Leatherface, and the film presents it in this way as well. But nope. But more on this later. The group arrives at a rest stop diner after ditching their Gorman House uniforms. In an altercation with waitress Tammy, played by Nicole Andrews, Ike and Clarice begin a murder spree within the diner, which forces them to flee. Hartman arrives on the scene and pieces together that one of the escaped inmates is in fact Jed Sawyer. That night, the escapees take refuge in an abandoned mobile home. Believing that everybody is asleep, Elizabeth tries to escape, but Ike stops her from doing so. He then becomes engaged in a fight with Jackson and insults Bud, leading to his own demise. The next morning, Clarice notices Ike is missing and heads off to find him. She searches the woods and is consequently apprehended by a patrolling Hartman. Upon disparaging both him and his dead daughter, he impulsively kills her as the others watch from a distance. Horrified, Elizabeth flees with Jackson in tow. As the police car passes, she screams for help, causing the deputy to notice them. The deputy attempts to call for backup, resulting in the killing of Bud in the ensuing struggle, which at this point really confirmed the rumor of this film's supposed plot twist that had already been leaked well before the release of the film itself, in that the person you think is Leatherface isn't actually Leatherface. So, as we were all expecting Bud, this big hulking guy with a depleted mental state who doesn't talk, to become Leatherface at some point in the movie, that carpet gets ripped out from underneath us, as said spoiler leak is confirmed to have been correct all along, because Bud is dead after getting his brains blown out. I was even thinking, well, maybe he survives the gunshot wound or something and comes back later as Leatherface. You know, the Leatherface we all know. But nope, he's just dead. This isn't Leatherface. It's not Jed, as he probably should have been, if we're being honest. He's just the twist. Jackson is actually Jed. Yeah, this twist did not win anybody over. But anyways, an enraged Jackson kills Deputy Sorrells, played by Finn Jones. Panicking, Jackson and Elizabeth steal his vehicle and try to reach safety, but are pursued by the deranged Hartman. He opens fire on them, and one of the bullets severs Jackson's face, while another one injures Elizabeth, causing the vehicle to careen off the side of the road. Later that night, Elizabeth regains consciousness at the barn where Betty Hartman was murdered, discovering that she and Jackson are being held hostage by Sheriff Hartman. Planning to kill them both, he gleefully tells Elizabeth that Jackson is really Jedediah Sawyer. However, the Sawyer family arrives to save the helpless Jedediah, beating Hartman into submission and taking all three of them into captivity. Back at the Sawyer home, Verna stitches the remnants of Jedediah's face and applies a muzzle to hold them together. She then leads him into a room where his siblings are holding Elizabeth and Hartman captive. Verna gifts Jedediah with a chainsaw, and Elizabeth watches in horror as he bisects Hartman to death. As the family celebrates, Elizabeth flees into the woods while the Sawyers give chase. She nearly escapes, only to be caught in a bear trap. Elizabeth attempts to appeal to Jedediah's sympathy, while Verna encourages him to kill her to protect the family. Unable to recall events prior to his injury, Jedediah begins to listen to Elizabeth's pleas, but kills her after she insults Verna. The next morning, Verna burns the evidence of the prior night's events, and the other Sawyers feed the remains of their victims to the pigs. And it's worth noting, if you haven't already, that we get a pretty good look at grown-up, pre-Vietnam War Nubbins, played by Dan Angelov, who seems a little more coherent and less crazy in this movie, for obvious reasons. In the house basement, Jedediah crafts the faces of Hal Hartman and Elizabeth into one fully fleshed out mask, donning it in front of the mirror as he applies lipstick. The film ends with him smashing the mirror at the side of his reflection. Not a bad flick. Not a bad flick at all. Not great, but not bad. Definitely worth being a part of the Chainsaw franchise, even if it is hard to accept this as the true backstory of the 1974 film, which is the camp of people I definitely fall into with this film, because while this film, from a story standpoint, leads to that film, the threads work, things add up, etc., it still doesn't feel like it actually belongs to that same world, but maybe an alternate version of that world. But I guess the same could be said about Texas Chainsaw 3D, I suppose, where although it worked, for the most part, at being a direct sequel to the original, it never really felt 100% like it got all the way there, which can be chalked up to the length of time between the original and these films, as well as the visual style changes and, of course, the cast and crew changes, which happens after 4 decades, so yeah. For me, the only film that legitimately feels like it's part of the exact continuity of the first film is the original 1986 sequel. As batshit a film as that is, it's the only one that feels 100% proper, of the same world, and of the same continuity. But again, these aren't really faults as much as they are observations about the 2017 film. If you can get past the mountains and the unnecessary plot twist, I think you'll probably enjoy yourself. It's cool to see Ted Hardesty in the film, who was actually Sally and Franklin's father, and having Sheriff Hartman, the father of Bert from the Chainsaw 3D, be both the anti-hero and villain of the film, is a nice bit of continuity thread to tie together this prequel and the 2013 requel. And it's kind of poetic, considering how bad of a person his son Bert is, and ended up being down the road. Since Hartman dies in the film, one can naturally assume that Bert is already an infant somewhere, or at least a small child. This leads me to wonder if this is why Bert hates the Sawyers so much in Texas Chainsaw 3D, because technically, his sister was killed by them at the beginning of this film. I wonder how aware of these things he is down the road. Something to ponder. In that regards, maybe he isn't that much of a bad guy in 3D. Something to think about. When it comes down to it, I can relate to the sheriff. I mean, if my little girl was murdered by this deranged family, I'd be bloodthirsty for vengeance too. It's hard to villainize them too much, am I right? All in all, the cast and crew did a great job putting together a pretty fun little movie. It never gets boring, the violence is pretty damn violent, the cinematography is excellent, the score works well, and the movie has a flow to it that is undeniably smooth. I prefer the 2006 prequel over this prequel, but that's a continuity argument in and of itself. This is still a good movie and a solid attempt to tell the backstory of the 1974 film, plot twist aside, of course. Leatherface, the 2017 prequel from filmmakers Julian Mori and Alexandra Bustillo, is worth the watch. From filmmaker David Blue Garcia comes the 2022 Chainsaw entry that is not only the franchise's second requel, connecting directly to the original film and disregarding all other entries, but is also the second film of the series to exclusively hit streaming as its primary method of distribution. The Netflix era of Leatherface, 2022's simply titled Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When the film was first announced back in early 2020, there was a fantastic oil painting style teaser poster that released with the announcement, promising that the face of fear was returning in 2021. The film, at the time still without an official title, was shaping up to be yet another requel, with the early promotional tidbits championing the project as a return to form for the series, as well as being another direct sequel to the original 1974 film, unrelated to any of the original sequels, unrelated to the 3D and Leatherface continuity, and certainly having nothing to do with the remake releases. This, of course, was a little off-putting. I mean, at this point, I'm already over the whole requel thing. Either give us a proper sequel that follows one of the traditional timelines of the series, or give us a hard reboot yet again. Stop making direct sequels to the original. I mean, God, what's next? A requel to Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, or Scream? Damn, maybe I shouldn't have said that out loud. As lukewarm as audiences were regarding Texas Chainsaw or Leatherface, I still would have liked to explore that continuity a bit more, and explore what happens to Heather and Jed after the events of 3D. But alas, we didn't get that, and we probably never will, as everybody involved with those line of films lost the rights to the franchise after it took so long to put out the 2017 film. With that said, I braced for impact, hoped for the best, but tried to put the project to the back of my mind and not linger in the hype of the production as much as possible, which is the opposite of my usual stance when it comes to these movies. I was just too checked out already with its status as yet another requel, so I kind of just figured, I hope this is good, and if not, oh well. I mean, how bad could it really be, right? Right? It wasn't until all of the supposed drama unfolded with production that I became interested once again, albeit just for a moment, when the film's directing team, Ryan and Andy Hill, were fired from the film after having already shot footage and replaced thereafter by David Garcia. I'm not really sure how much footage was actually shot or why the studio didn't like it, but it was a clear indicator that things were not going well. I mean, this is never good news regarding the production of a film. Again, I let the project once again leave my mind and told myself to just wait for the trailer, which I did, and after finally getting the chance to see it, after being hyped up about it all day beforehand, I was not crazy about it. I didn't hate it. Actually, that's a lie. Yes, I did. I hated this trailer, and I really wanted to like it, but it really did just seem like the complete opposite of a chainsaw film. The look wasn't great, the small town set looked anything but authentic and felt more like a movie set than an actual place. The look of Leatherface was just droopy and melted and just not right. The cast looked god-awful, like the most woke garbage cast you could possibly find, annoying, in Texas for the dumbest reasons ever, and topped by a cherry of that terrible, terrible, terrible bus scene.
Try anything and you're canceled, bro.
Oh, fuck.
Not to mention Sally. Don't get me started on this. Although Sally came first, this version of Sally is just Laurie Strode from Halloween 2018. Same exact type of characterization, motivation, just no. Played by a different actress, no less. Not that that's the fault of anyone, since Marilyn Burns herself passed away back in 2014, but if you can't have the original Sally, don't have Sally at all, especially considering this is supposed to be the direct sequel to the '74 film. Yeah, one of the cringiest and most non-chainsaw trailers I've ever seen. There's no way the film could be as bad as this trailer, right? Right? It just seemed like more direct sequel to the original content for the sake of being direct sequel to the original content, riding the requel wave fad, because let's call it what it is, it's a fad, just another era, like the reboot or remake eras. Everybody's doing it because everybody else is doing it. That's the only reason they did this movie, was because they saw the success of Halloween 2018. But again, I just want to remind everybody, Texas Chainsaw 3D did it first. This is also the second movie to film in Bulgaria, so there's that. But anyways, let's get on with it. Nearly 50 years after Leatherface's killing spree in 1973, young entrepreneurs Melody and Dante, played by Sarah Markin and Jacob Lattimore, Melody's sister Leela, played by Elsie Fisher, and Dante's girlfriend Ruth, played by Nell Hudson, travel to the abandoned Texas town of Harlow to auction off old properties to create a trendy, heavily gentrified area. While inspecting a dilapidated orphanage, the group discovers that it's still occupied by an elderly woman named Ginny, played by Alice Krieg. When she claims she has papers to prove she still owns the property, an argument breaks out, briefly interrupted by a silent and towering man from upstairs, played by Mark Burnham, who is actually an old man Leatherface. Ginny then collapses from a heart attack and is rushed to the hospital, accompanied by Ruth and the still unknown man. An investor, Catherine, played by Jessica Elaine, along with a group of potential buyers arrive in Harlow on a large party bus, distracting Melody and Dante. Meanwhile, Leela strikes up a friendship with the local mechanic, Richter, played by Mo Dunford, and reveals she was actually a survivor of a school shooting, leaving her terrified of guns. Ginny dies en route to the hospital. Ruth texts Melody before the man goes berserk and murders the officers driving the ambulance, leading it to crash. When Ruth awakes, she witnesses the man, revealed to be Leatherface, cutting off Ginny's face to wear as a mask. Ruth manages to radio for help before being killed by Leatherface herself, who makes his way back to Harlow. During the property auction, Melody reads Ruth's texts and prepares to leave with Leela. Richter overhears them talking about Ginny's death and takes their keys, agreeing to give them back once they provide proof they rightfully removed Ginny from her home. Melody and Dante return to the orphanage to find them. Sally Hardesty, the sole survivor of Leatherface's previous killing spree, and now a battle-hardened Texas Ranger, played by Alwyn Forer, and I'm probably butchering that name, apologies, learns of Ruth's attack and heads out to investigate. At the orphanage, Melody discovers the papers and realizes that Ginny was wrongfully evicted. Leatherface arrives at the orphanage and attacks Dante, mutilating him. Melody hides as Leatherface retrieves his chainsaw from the bedroom. A thunderstorm hits Harlow as night falls, and Catherine and Leela take cover in the bus with the buyers. Dante manages to stumble out of the orphanage, where he is discovered by Richter before bleeding to death. Richter enters the orphanage and is attacked and killed by Leatherface. Melody retrieves the car and bus keys from his body before fleeing the house, reuniting with Leela. They get on the bus, pursued by Leatherface, who slaughters all of the people aboard, including Catherine. Melody and Leela escape the carnage and come across Sally, who locks them in her car before entering the orphanage to finally confront Leatherface. She holds him at gunpoint, demanding he remembers the pain he inflicted on her and her friends, but is met only by silence before Leatherface walks away. Leatherface then attacks the sisters in Sally's car, but they are saved by Sally, who shoots him. Sally gives Melody the keys to drive away before pursuing Leatherface. Leatherface ambushes and fatally injures Sally. Melody hits Leatherface with Sally's car before crashing into a nearby building. Melody is trapped but orders Lila to run away. When Leatherface appears, Melody apologizes for what they did to Jenny. As he moves in to attack, Leela attempts to shoot him, but her gun is empty. Sally shoots him instead and he flees. Before dying, she encourages Leela not to run, as she will be forever haunted by him as she was. Leela then takes Sally's shotgun and pursues Leatherface into an abandoned building, where she is ambushed and attacked. Melody arrives and takes Leatherface's chainsaw before using it to uppercut him, knocking him into a pool of water where he sinks to the bottom, or so they think. They escape and Leela finds Sally's hat and puts it on before starting the morning drive back home. However, Leatherface emerges, still alive, and drags Melody out of the car before decapitating her with a chainsaw. A horrified Leela watches as the self-driving car takes her out of the town of Harlow. Leatherface dances in the street with his chainsaw and Melody's head. In a post-credits scene, Leatherface makes his way to the house where his original massacre took place in 1973. Okay, well, that was a movie, that's for sure. Not as bad as I thought it was going to be, especially considering how awful that damn trailer was. Not a great chainsaw film by any means, but not bad either. As a direct sequel to the original film, I think this movie does what it set out to do, which was tell a story that takes place 40 years later. But when it comes down to the battle of the two Chainsaw requels, I think Texas Chainsaw did a better job. It had better characters, a better setting, a better narrative structure, and seemed like a more fulfilling storyline than what was presented in TCM 2022. I enjoy Leatherface in the 22 film, and Mark Burnham, like Dan Yeager before him, did a pretty good job channeling Gunnar Hansen. But of course, nobody will ever get that down to 100%, am I right? That just can't be replicated. But again, pretty good job, that's for sure. I wasn't a big fan of the mask in 2022 though. It just looked too droopy and double-chinned and just like Clayface from Batman or something. I just wasn't a big fan of that mask. Not that the masks seen in Texas Chainsaw 2013 were any better, but at least we got a couple different ones in that movie to choose from. This movie also wasn't as woke as I feared it was going to be. It was actually more of a mockery of this generation's woke culture than anything else, which is quite hilarious when you think about it. So props to the filmmakers for that. It was actually pretty unexpected and refreshing. The school shooting thing was a little on the nose, but it did work for the character. Was it kind of a weird thing to randomly have in a Chainsaw sequel? Yes, but it worked for what they did, I guess. Sally Hardesty was also not a total travesty as far as her character is concerned. The actress did a pretty good job given what she had to work with, but still, a little too 2018 Laurie Strode for my taste. What they did to her character, though, by just having her get killed by Leatherface after so many decades, even after she realizes he doesn't even remember her at all, a la Laurie Strode with Michael Myers in 2018, it just feels a little tacky, even a bit disrespectful to Marilyn Burns if we're being honest. There's also nothing in this movie harkening back to the 74 film, unlike Texas Chainsaw 2013, which is stupid considering this makes a point to be a direct sequel, yet the only connection is Leatherface being in this town. It's just, come on, man. The fact that the masses seem to think this is the superior sequel over 2013 is beyond me. I don't understand that at all. I mean, we had a full slew of characters with histories and personalities in that film, with a well-rounded story that had an actual first, second, and third act. This movie was just a basic slasher movie, yet everybody loves it besides me. I just don't get it. A massacre in Texas with Leatherface is not enough. It's just not. Those parameters don't automatically equal to a perfect Chainsaw movie. If it sounds like I'm being too harsh, trust me when I say that I'm not, because there's actually a lot I'm just not touching on for the sake of time. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, the cast and crew do have some positive attributes. The film looks good, sounds good, And although this is another chainsaw film shot in Bulgaria, it does feel a bit more like Texas than 2017's Leatherface, which is one point in this film's favor, I suppose. This film isn't unwatchable in any way or by any means, and I'm sure a lot of you will have fun with this one, regardless of my old man grumpiness or not. But to me, 2013 was a superior requel in every way in comparison to this film. And although I'm glad this film did well, I also sort of hate that, because it means more of this direction versus something else entirely. But what are you gonna do, right? Could have been way worse, that's for sure. You probably think I'm about to rate this movie a solid 0 out of 10, but I promise you that Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if not just once, is worth the watch.